In this lesson, we are working on 4.NBT.3, rounding multi-digit numbers. One of the things I always tell students is some of those little lingo that hopefully helps math stick into kids' brains. But one thing that I always say are little sayings to hopefully help them to remember. So I always tell them, first thing we want to do is, like, if we're rounding, let's say we're going to round to the nearest 1,000. We're going to round to the nearest 1,000. So I want to underline the place I'm rounding to. So if I'm underlining the place I'm rounding to the nearest 1,000, I'm going to underline the 3. And then another thing we always say is the rounding neighbor. So here's the rounding neighbor. The rounding neighbor is always to the right, always the next place to the right. So I'm going to circle my rounding neighbor. And then we have rules for our rounding neighbor. If our rounding neighbor is 5 or more, we're going to add one more to the underlined digit. If our rounding neighbor is 4 or less, we're going to let our underlined digit rest. Okay, so in this case, we got 5 or more, add one more, 4 or less, let it rest. So in this case, we have a 4, so we're going to 4 or less, we're going to let the neighbor rest. It's going to stay at a 3. And the other thing I always tell students is that the rounding neighbor and everything to the right will become zeros. So now we can rewrite the number as we are rounding here. So those all become zeros. So 253,497 to the nearest 1,000 will be 253,000. Okay, let's do another one. We'll do to the millions place here. Okay, so let's say I'm going to round to the nearest, we'll say the nearest 100,000 place. So we'll underline 100,000 digit, place we're rounding to. Always underline the place you're rounding to, so this is the nearest 100,000. Maybe I should just jot that down. Okay, and I'm going to circle my rounding neighbor. My rounding neighbor is the place to the right, always one place over to the right. And again, our rule, if our rounding neighbor is 5 or more, we're going to add one more. If our rounding neighbor is 4 or less, we're going to let it rest. So our rounding neighbor is 5 or more, so we are going to add one more to the underlined digit. And the rounding neighbor and everything to the right will become zeros. So still have 1 in the millions place. In the 100,000s place, we have 7 plus 1 is 8. And all the other digits change into 0. So 1,758,630 to the nearest 100,000 would be 1,800,000. Hopefully these steps help, but reminding your child about the rounding neighbor rule, which is another thing we record in our math journals, but also those little sayings help as well. 5 or more, add one more, 4 or less, let it rest, those kinds of things. And just using the same terminology at home as we use at school is often very helpful. So hopefully this lesson has helped you to see how we learn